All right, so this is chapter 10, Religion and Reform. We are inching closer and closer to our culminating chapter. That's chapter 14, the Civil War. And so each of these chapters that we talk about from here on out are really going to start showing the steps that are leading up to the Civil War. So, the early 19th century, remember that means the early 1800s, is a time of immense change in the United States, and we've talked about this the past few chapters. Economic changes, political changes, demographic changes, territorial changes, which are going to continue to change, and we're going to talk about that more in chapter 12. It's also a period of great optimism. The idea of self-governance really infuses everything from religion to politics. It's also a time, unfortunately, of great conflict. Of course, we just mentioned that all of this is going to start building into the Civil War, so we know there's obviously going to be some conflict there. But it's also seen in other things. The benefit of industrialization and the democratization of America is evident along uneven lines of gender, race, and class. Some people are benefiting, but some people are certainly being left behind. So Americans begin to wonder if the moral fabric of our nation will hold up to social changes. This great experiment that is the United States that many felt wouldn't make it. A lot of people, once we won our independence, it was shocking enough that we won our independence to begin with. And secondly, a lot of people felt like, well, it's not going to last long. And so people began to wonder if it will last long, or is it going to hold up to all these social changes? And part of that, part of what people are going to use to help understand the changes around them are going to be spiritual revivalism and a movement of social reform, both of which are very much intertwined with one another, and we're going to talk about that. And both of these are going to be used by people to help them understand the changing world around them. So first we'll focus on the Second Great Awakening, which reignited the Protestant spirituality of the United States. The revivals that were used by the Second Great Awakening incorporated people from all regions of the United States. Many people believed human society could look more heavenly, and so that's where the joining of these spiritual networks to social reform networks is going to come in. And these people who were very much religious in nature and feeling that religious revivalism are going to turn to reform movements, and they're going to tackle many different types of issue: alcoholism, slavery, and women's rights, as well as some others that we will mention. And essentially, their overarching goal, no matter which reform movement they're involved in, is to try to make the world a better place. So let's focus on the Second Great Awakening first. By the end of the 18th century, it's the 1700s, the fervor of the First Great Awakening dies down. And starting in the early 19th century, then, a new wave of religious enthusiasm starts to take place, and this is referred to as, conveniently, the Second Great Awakening. And it's similar to the First Great Awakening in that it's not a coordinated movement. It's something that happens sporadically, but spreads throughout much of the country. And in this case, it begins in the West and spreads to the East. So, how did the religious outlook of the Second Great Awakening change from that of the Puritans? So I've divided this into two columns, and you can just go straight across to kind of understand the differences. Whereas the Puritans believed in a just but very stern God, the Second Great Awakening focused on a gentler divinity of love and grace. Whereas the Puritans believed that humanity was doomed by original sin, and that there was only a small group of people who would be marked for heaven, called the elect, and that they had been determined even before they were born, and the much larger population was already damned. On the other hand, the Second Great Awakening stressed that humanity had an inherent goodness. So you were inherently good. You were not necessarily inherently bad like the Puritans assumed. And they emphasized each individual's potential for self-improvement. So you're not born doomed or elect, right? You have the ability, you could start off life as a great sinner and change. You could change your life's trajectory. So whereas the Puritans believed that God controlled the destiny of each human being, the Second Great Awakening preachers stressed that each individual was a moral free agent. They could improve themselves and they could improve society. Again, you're not doomed or saved before birth. And this helped inspire the belief of perfectionism, or the faith in the human ability to consciously build a just society. And so there you can see the development of that close link between religion and reform. And this awakened many people to these moral issues that we're going to talk about in a second here. So Joseph Smith, again, coming out of this tradition of the Second Great Awakening, claimed that God had appeared to him in a vision. And that after this, angels had led him to the burial of writings from an ancient Christian civilization. So their belief there was that an ancient Christian civilization had come to North America and left behind all of these writings for Smith to find. Smith published his visions and his findings in the Book of Mormon in 1830, and it became very popular, largely due to the fact that it is a very much an evangelist religion. It requires young people to go out and to try to convert people as part of their life, as part of their faith journey. So it continues to grow, and as it grows, it faces a lot of opposition from existing Protestant ministers, and it forces them into several moves, because everywhere they go, they encounter this resistance. So from New York, they moved to Ohio, from Ohio to Missouri, and from Missouri to Illinois. And they actually established a very thriving community at a place called Nauvoo in Illinois, where they settle for a time. Here, Smith continues to preach his revelations. One of his most controversial revelations is that he told that it was revealed to him that he and a select group of his followers could take multiple wives. So obviously that was very controversial, and for this and other reasons he was murdered in 1844. A new leader emerges named Brigham Young, who eventually brings the Mormons to where they are usually associated with nowadays, and that's Salt Lake City, Utah. Okay, so remember, all this spiritualism is also tied up in other types of reform. So the reform movements that we'll talk about are very much inspired and linked to this religious enthusiasm of the Second Great Awakening. So the first that we'll talk about is educational reform, and we'll focus here on Horace Mann, who at the time was the leading U.S. educational reformer. He was the secretary of the newly created Massachusetts Board of Education, and as such, he wrote a series of annual reports on education in Massachusetts, but these reports influenced education across America. Mann sponsored many reforms in Massachusetts that then get taken up across America, such as a longer school year, higher pay for teachers, which in turn attracted more qualified teachers to want to seek that position, and a larger public school system. And because of this, he is often called the father of the common school movement. Emma Willard is another early educational reform movement. She particularly was focused on women's education, and she founded the Troy Female Seminary to further women's higher education, this was the first women's school of higher education. So if you were in school at this time, most likely you would learn to read, and you would learn your lessons from a series of graded textbooks. So this means like different levels, like level readers today, if you remember those from elementary school. These were McGuffey readers, sometimes referred to as eclectic readers. And they had a series of stories that illustrated the virtues of patriotism, hard work, and honesty. Also, the first half of the 19th century saw a dramatic increase in the number of newspapers, from about 1,200 in 1833 to 3,000 in 1860. And so what does this do? It promotes literacy, more newspapers, more opportunity to read, so better literacy, and a more well-informed public, because if you're reading newspapers, hopefully that means you are better informed about what's going on in your nation and the world around you. So overall, education is increasing in commonality and in quality, and people are, again, becoming more and more engaged in the world around them. This is also a time of reform for care for the mentally ill, led mainly by Dorothea Dix. She launched a crusade to create special hospitals for the mentally ill. Prior to this, most people who were mentally ill were kept in prisons with criminals. So this is obviously an area of great reform, but remember, we have to be sure not to look at this from our own mindset. We've come a long way in our understanding of mental illness, and they had little to no understanding of mental illness at the time. And so Dorothea Dix is going to be the one who starts this change in a positive direction, though it was imperfect, of course, at the time. She was a tireless champion for reform. For example, she traveled more than 10,000 miles and visited almost every state in her efforts at reform. She was involved in a couple other movements, but her focus mainly was on treatment of the mentally ill. And she and other reformers created the first generation of mental asylums. And by the 1850s, there were special hospitals in 28 states for the mentally ill. Now, these were not great places by modern standards, by any stretch of the imagination, but the idea that the mentally ill were not criminals simply because of their mental illness was a step in the positive direction. All right, so now we're going to focus on a movement that I feel like really gets a bad rap because of what happened in Prohibition, and that's the temperance movement. So the temperance movement is this campaign to convince Americans to either drink less alcohol or drink none at all. And everybody likes to just look at the temperance movement like it was a bunch of boring people who wanted to make life boring by taking away alcohol. And that's not entirely true. The temperance movement was largely led by women's rights advocates. And the reason why that is because there really actually was a drinking problem in the United States. By the early 1800s, America had 14,000 distilleries producing 25 gallons of alcoholic drink each year. And by 1830, Americans drank 5 gallons of alcohol per capita. So there was actually a drinking problem in America. And the reason why these women took it up is because it often manifested itself in terms of domestic violence. And so it was a huge problem. Obviously, eventually when it gets taken over at the federal level and alcohol is banned, it is not executed well. But again, in fairness to them, they were trying to fix an actual problem. And I think that's something that a lot of people overlook when they talk about the temperance movement. So the American Society for the Promotion of Temperance was founded in 1826. It boasted 5,000 different state and local temperance groups. So again, that's evidence that they are actually fighting a legitimate problem. And their campaign against steam and rum does work. By the mid-1840s, Americans' average has gone down to 2 gallons per capita. So I put that right before women's rights, and I'm putting the women's rights movement in between temperance and the abolition movement because these three are very much intertwined. So focusing here on the Seneca Falls Convention of 1848. So in 1848, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott organized the first convention in support of women's rights, and it met for 2 days. And while there, the delegates discussed the social, civil, religious conditions and rights of women. And they issued a document called the Declaration of Sentiments and Resolutions. This was modeled after the Declaration of Independence, and if it's an overarching theme, it largely demanded greater rights for women. So again, women's rights, temperance, the abolition movement, they are all very much intertwined with each other. And the reason for this is that during the 1830s and 1840s, many women were dedicating themselves to working for the abolition of slavery. And led by Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucretia Mott, and a small group of other women, they realized that they too were victims of injustice. And so again, you can see that intertwining there. And so because of that, the abolition movement inspired the demand for equal rights for women. If we're going to demand rights for slaves and for free blacks as well, then we should also be demanding rights for women, for all women. Even though they were demanding rights for all women, minorities, rich, poor, middle class. Middle class white women from the North dominated this movement. And this is simply because poor women did not have the time or the resources to participate. They are very much taken up with the day-to-day struggle of making ends meet in a time that was not friendly at all to poor people. Not that it's ever a good time to be poor, but certainly not at this time. It was especially difficult. And so the movement was very much dominated by this white middle class viewpoint. So Stanton and Mott questioned the prevailing theory that women should be subordinate to men. And this is really the beginning of a women's rights movement in the United States that's going to continue on throughout the 20th century and even into the 21st century. Primarily written by Stanton, the Declaration of Sentiments and Resolutions called for greater divorce and child custody rights, equal opportunities in education for women, the right for women to retain their property after marriage, and the right to vote, which of course women did not have at the time. And these demands really form the main platform of the women's rights movement, even going into the 20th century. And so these are very important ideas that are going to propel the movement forward. All right, so switching gears now and talking about the abolitionist movement, because again, these are intertwined movements. Many people who participated in the abolitionist movement were also women involved in the women's rights movement, and they were also people who advocated for temperance. So all very much the same kind of people working here. Okay, so the prevailing abolitionist society at the time was the American Colonization Society, which was founded in 1817. Its view on how to abolish slavery in the United States was for a gradual emancipation of slaves, such as they had in the North. However, with the goal of returning the freed slaves back to Africa. So that's pretty strange for a lot of people to kind of comprehend, and that is something that's going to change. Not everybody's going to see that as a good idea. It obviously has a huge flaw, and that the vast majority of people, the slave trade is outlawed in 1808. The vast majority of people at this time are born in the United States and have no connection, no knowledge of Africa. They were born here, and so to send them back is pretty clearly unfair. So on top of that, a lot of members in this organization opposed slavery, but then at the same time were very openly racist, which doesn't seem to go hand in hand, but that's the way it was. The leaders did not believe that free blacks could be integrated into American society. So for example, Henry Clay argued that since an unconquerable prejudice would prevent free blacks from assimilation, it would be better for them to emigrate back to Africa. To this end, the American Colonization Society was fundamental in the founding of the colony of Liberia on Africa's west coast, with the goal of that would be the destination for these freed slaves. This gradual approach, however, could never resolve the issue of slavery. And so to illustrate why, just consider these numbers. By 1800, this organization had helped approximately 12,000 freed blacks migrate to Liberia, which sounds like a big number until you compare it to the fact that at the time there were about 4 million slaves in the South. So, yeah, that's the drop in the bucket. This is clearly not going to be the approach that's going to work. So the man who really changes the trajectory of the abolitionist movement is this guy, William Lloyd Garrison. William Lloyd Garrison began his career as a newspaper editor working with a fellow abolitionist named Benjamin Lundy in Baltimore. And he initially supported the American Colonization Society and their gradual support, as did most abolitionists at the time. However, Garrison soon became convinced that this gradual approach would never work, and his contact with slavery in Baltimore transformed him into what at the time was considered a radical abolitionist. And again, his views would not be considered radical now, but at the time, they were very much so. He believed that slavery was cruel, brutal and sinful, and that it should be immediately abolished. Over time, Garrison's views became more and more militant. He resolved to move to Boston to get out of the South and begin his own anti-slavery newspaper to advocate for his own personal beliefs on the abolitionist movement. And on January 1st, 1831, a 26-year-old Garrison began to publish The Liberator. This was a very small newspaper with very low circulation. In its first year, for example, the 4-page weekly only had 6 subscribers, so very low. And his maximum circulation was never more than 5,000 newspapers, so pretty small. However, this modest circulation really misrepresented the significance of The Liberator. His uncompromising call for immediate and uncompensated emancipation, because a lot of people at the time believed that, well, slavery is wrong, the slaves should be gradually freed, and in the process their owners should be compensated for the loss of their slaves. And he did not believe that that is something that should happen. And this marked the beginning of a radical movement to abolish slavery and transform American society. I don't know if you could consider any abolition approach to be friendly towards the planters, because they're trying to get rid of the slaves. But definitely the ACS, the prevailing theory at the time, is more planter friendly than this. This is very much a more militant approach. On top of that, in a clear contrast to the ACS, William Lloyd Garrison believed that blacks and whites could work together, that we didn't need to send all the former slaves back to Africa, that there could be a biracial cooperation. And in fact, The Liberator called for biracial cooperation within the anti-slavery movement. Hey, why don't we get some voices of free blacks and former slaves? Let's get their voices in this movement, so it's not just middle-class white people advocating for the abolition of slavery. And Garrison and The Liberator also played a key role in founding the American Anti-Slavery Society, which was organized in 1833 and then rapidly grew across the North. So we have more of this, again, pretty clear-cut approach to the abolition of slavery. It should be immediate and it should be uncompensated. This is probably his most famous quote on the subject. "Let Southern oppressors tremble. I shall strenuously contend for immediate enfranchisement. I will be as harsh as truth and uncompromising as justice. I do not wish to think or speak or write with moderation. I will not excuse, I will not retreat a single inch, and I will be heard." And so this is going to grow in popularity among those who believe slavery is an evil, this approach to abolitionism. So the American Anti-Slavery Society, as you can see, was pretty radical at the time. It was uncompromising and it was intensely moralistic. And by that I mean it believed slavery was a sin. Garrison argued that sinners aren't asked to gradually stop sinning, and since slave owners, as he saw them, were sinners, they should repent immediately and free their slaves. The leaders of the Anti-Slavery Society were predominantly religious-minded, middle-class men and women who were initially united by their unyielding opposition to slavery. So again, no wishy-washiness, no let's do it gradually, let's compensate the slave owners. Very much, no, this is a moral evil and it needs to be stopped immediately. No compensation to the slave owners. However, over time, two very divisive issues split the organization into rival factions. The first is that Garrison believed that the society should fully endorse women's rights, which was not a widely held belief at the time. He felt that women had the right to play an important role in the abolition movement, whereas more moderates disagreed. They believed that women's rights was a secondary issue and that of primary importance was abolishing slavery, and that if they included women's rights within the movement, that would divide attentions, it would be too much for the population to handle, and it just wouldn't happen. The second was that Garrison opposed any kind of political action. He didn't believe it was necessary. He believed that abolitionists should rely on moral persuasion, appeal to the souls of the people of the South and get them to want to repent and change their ways. The moderates believe that this is impractical. This is never going to happen. And they founded the Liberty Party in 1840 and supported the Free Soil Party in 1848 in retaliation against Garrison, as they saw his kind of pie in the sky idea kind of way of thinking. We'll talk more about those two issues later on. All right, so again, Garrison called for more black voices within the abolitionist movement, and the most famous of which at the time was Frederick Douglass. At the time, he was America's foremost, although not the only, black abolitionist. He was born a slave in Maryland, but he escaped his bondage in 1838 at the age of 21. He was recruited by Garrison, and he came on board as a lecturer for the American Anti-Slavery Society. And he really enthralled audiences with his commanding personal presence, his authentic stories about the horrors of slavery, which he told very well. He was very much a good storyteller, and he really had that ability to really hook people into listening to what he had to say. Not only was he a great public speaker, he was also a prolific writer. His most famous is probably the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, which was published in 1845, and described his life on the Maryland plantation in which he was born, and describes various incidences, such as a brutal fight that he had with a slave driver and his dramatic escape to the North. In 1847, he founded the North Star, which was an influential anti-slavery newspaper specifically for blacks. Of course, at the time, most slaves cannot read because of laws against it. But there is also a large community of free blacks, and they want to become involved in the abolitionist movement as well, and North Star helped to further that cause. His eloquent speeches and writings thus played an important role in persuading a growing number of Northerners that slavery is evil, and that the spread of slavery into Western lands should not be halted. And we'll talk about this more when we talk about the publication of Uncle Tom's Cabin, but you think like, well, shouldn't everybody know that slavery is evil and what's going on is wrong? And they may think it in theory, but the details of it, the details of the brutality are not something that somebody living in the North would really be familiar with. Again, you have to think about the time. You're living on your farm in Illinois, let's say, and maybe you get access to newspapers, but there's no TV, there's no radio, there's no social media, there's not a widespread means by which stories like this could be published. So when stories like Frederick Douglass's are actually published and people can read the details, they're shocked, and they start coming around more to the idea that this is something that should be stopped immediately. All right, switching gears to talk about two remaining reforms. They're not really reforms, but movements, I suppose we could say, of this time. First, we'll talk about transcendentalism, not transcendentalism like transcendental meditation. This is different. So, transcendentalists were a small group of writers and thinkers who lived in and around the Boston area specifically. Their leaders were pretty well-known people. You might have heard of some of them. Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry David Thoreau, Walden, and Margaret Fuller. They published a journal of literature, art, and ideas called The Dial, and they actually had a female editor of this journal. Margaret Fuller was the first editor. So what did the transcendentalists believe? They had the following key beliefs, and we'll focus on four. Number one was the divinity of man. They believed that God lived within each individual and that each person possessed an inner soul or spirit with the capacity to find spiritual truth. So again, very much in the tradition of the Second Great Awakening, you can see the influence here in which they are talking about the individual and the individual's capacity to learn, change, grow, and to become better. Two, the value of human intuition. They actually wanted to minimize logic and reason, very much different from the Enlightenment thinkers. They believed that human intuition transcended, hence transcendentalism, or rose above the limits of reason, that logic and reason could only go so far, and you had to prioritize your own personal intuition. Because they believed that intuition enabled humans to discover and understand certain spiritual truths that logic and reason could not reveal. Three, nonconformity and dissent. They were very fiercely, uncompromisingly individualistic, and they rejected the idea of tyranny of the majority. And for the importance of nature, this was a big one with the transcendentalists. They believed that truth could be found in nature and that communion with nature would lead to religious experiences that enlightened the soul. So the most famous example of this would be Thoreau, who turned away from what he considered the artificially civilized life and lived for 2 years in a cabin at the edge of Walden Pond near Concord, Massachusetts, and of course wrote a famous book about his experiences there. And finally, we'll talk about the creation of these utopian communities. A lot of transcendentalists turned to these utopian communities as a way of living out their beliefs. Utopian communities at the time were concrete social expressions of the perfectionist vision of achieving a better life through conscious acts of will. And so they found over 100 different communities between 1800 and 1900, though the peak was between 1830 and 1860, with the goal of trying to create a utopia, a perfect society away from all the evils of artificial society as they saw it. And none of them worked. So obviously, it's not, nobody has cracked the code on how to create a perfect society as of yet. So there's different kinds of communities that they created with this end goal in mind, and they all had similar goals. Number one, they rejected the competitive business practices of the market economy. 2, they tried to build an equal social order through an economy based on shared wealth. This is we're getting close to Karl Marx and communism and socialism, but this kind of predates that. 3, they regulated moral behavior so members could realize their full spiritual potential. And 4, they organized members into cooperative work and living units. So again, none of them worked. Brook Farm is probably the most famous of them. It was established in West Roxbury, Massachusetts in 1841 with the full support of a lot of the leading transcendentalists at the time. They experimented in plain living and high thinking. And again, it's very short-lived. So it's established in 1841, and by 1846, there was a fire, and they just scrapped the whole thing. So not a success. However, despite that, it did have a lasting impact on its members, one of which was the famous author of the Scarlet Letter, Nathaniel Hawthorne, who had this remembrance of his time there. Our beautiful scheme of a noble and unselfish life, and how fair in that first summer appeared the prospect that it might endure for generations. So, to conclude, by the Civil War, revival and reform movements have left an indelible mark on American life. The Second Great Awakening connected evangelical Christians in a national network of faith. So people are connected across the country by their Christian faith due to this revivalism in a way that they weren't before. And again, that connects them to these social reform networks. It spurs a middle-class desire to promote national morality and a public good. And participation in these reform movements encouraged many to see themselves in new ways. For example, Black activists became a more powerful voice in anti-slavery societies, and middle-class women pursued women's rights movement. And all of these efforts to make the United States a more virtuous and moral nation helped to develop the foundation for future social change. Which leads to our chapter question. The leaders of the women's rights movement and William Lloyd Garrison believed that the movement to abolish slavery should include a women's rights element. Most others believed these should be treated as separate issues. Should women's rights and abolition have been two interconnected movements? Explain your answer. And we will end this chapter there. Again, slowly easing towards the Civil War. We are only a couple chapters away, so stay tuned. We are nearing the end of this section.